Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 14th Annual Baltic Conference on Defense. This time it is a bit different from all the others. We have never had such a small crowd in a conference room, and we have never had such a big audience altogether, because 220 people are following the proceedings from their computer screens, wherever they are. It is a challenging time. Just another day, Martin, who is the main organizer of the conference, said that, what was the trouble actually in organizing a conference in the pre-pandemic times? Because basically everything we have to be dealing with are cancelled flights, masks, and a protocol, health protocol here. This conference is co-organized between ICDS and Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And we do that in cooperation with Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and Interallied Confédération of Reserve officers this time. I do mention also the sponsors by name, main sponsor Eurospike, and our sponsors BAE Systems, DevSec Intel, Namo, and Milwex. Thank you, sponsors. We will not be able to do it without you. Without further ado, I will leave the floor and give the stage over to Madam President.
Dear friends here in the room and behind your computer screens, dear ministers, Cravinho and Luik, ladies and gentlemen, I'm glad that this year's ABCD is very much about the role reserves and reservists play in our security environment, and that Estonia finally has a fair chance to promote our own reserve army and conscription model. I think it's necessary to talk much more about these things in a world where many Western experts are still used to count only fully professional soldiers and think of reserve units as a second-rate paper tigers. Or when we sometimes still see reputable think tanks issuing analyses about the defense of the Baltic states with statements that the Estonian defense force is made up of only one professional infantry battalion and will therefore be overrun in a couple of days. No, our real potential is much bigger. It's much bigger and has therefore very real implications on how the defense of Estonia and the Baltic states will look like, which is always the main topic of this conference, how to defend Baltics. Secondly, our current conscription and reserve model is by today just so impressive and well-functioning that I'm really a little bit surprised that we have been so modest about it, because we really do have a hidden jewel here, something that we must really be proud of, as proud as our reservists themselves are. Something that in the security and defense community could be what our digital ID, Skype, or e-residency is in the digital community. But having said that, I am also glad that our defense sector officers and civil servants are more about getting things really done and less about talking loudly about our exploits. But let's get down to what our officers have managed to create then. Of course, General Veiko Vello-Palm later probably goes more in depth. But for the sake of clarity, I'll sum up our system very shortly here. Through general conscription, our reserve army annually gets over 3,000 new reservists who have received some pretty good and thorough training during 8 or 11 months. And we train not just individual soldiering skills, but we produce integral companies, batteries, and battalions. These are units where every soldier knows the next man in line. In that way, we manage in 3 to 6 years to renew our whole wartime structure, which alongside the Defence League volunteers is some 21,000 strong currently. And it's not that much about how many conscripts we can train annually, but rather how many reserve units and how quickly we can mobilize and deploy when they are needed. Our whole reserve structure, 2 full-blown infantry brigades, a territorial defense structure amounting by numbers to another brigade, all the necessary support units can be mobilized not in weeks or months, but in the matter of just a couple of days. Not only does our legislation support this, but such is our readiness and mobilization system. Each reservist knows exactly to which wartime unit he or she belongs to and where to assemble in the case they're called up. And there, they have all of their equipment waiting for them, pre-packed, unit by unit, from rifles, uniforms, to trucks, armored personnel carriers, and howitzers. I know that foreign observers and allied officers are often very skeptical of these figures and reaction times. And I wouldn't probably believe them myself unless I wouldn't have had the chance to witness it with my own eyes. It was 2016 when we conducted the first SNAP exercise, and we do it every year. A randomly selected battalion from our wartime structure is called up without any prior notice. And we really see that the first reservists start arriving in 4 hours or so since the call-up order. And the whole battalion, with all their personnel and equipment, is fielded in about 24 to 36 hours since the start of the exercise. Why is this all important and relevant, including in the context of defending NATO's Baltic flank? First of all, it's about reaction speed and readiness. The current size and readiness of the opposing force, the Western military district of the Russian Federation, is such that technically they can launch a limited incursion against Baltic states in a very short time frame. Reserve forces have traditionally been considered something that need a lot of time to get going and combat ready. But we cannot have, and we do not have, such a slow system. This is especially important for me as the Supreme Commander of National Defense, because it is me who has to declare mobilization and state of war in case if deterrence should fail. And I can really sleep quite peacefully at night because I know that when the time should come, then the order of mobilization will be fulfilled in the matter of hours. And that this order will send into combat not poorly trained and poorly armed cannon fodder, but combat-ready, fully manned, well-trained citizens, whom the Estonian state has given the best chances of first survival and then success. Secondly, it's about the size of the force. We could never field a force this large with purely voluntary and professional service members, but we need to and can field much more thanks to our conscription and reserve system. Preparing infantry units is what we are really good at, where we can really combine quality with quantity. In the context of a NATO Article 5 operation, it's not infantry units that we would first need from our allies, but rather we need our allies to pitch in with capabilities and units that will always remain too expensive for us here in Estonia to develop ourselves. Thirdly, it's about the quality of our force. Don't get me wrong, I think that our fully professional officers and NCOs are probably the best in the world, but since there's relatively few of those who want to devote their whole life to military service, we don't want to fill rank-and-file positions with them, not to use them as assistant machine gunners, but rather as leaders and trainers. Conscription gives our reserve army annually over 3,000 of our society's best and brightest. Most of them are high school graduates or university students or high school graduates waiting to become after the military service university students, which means that they're smart guys. They learn quickly adapt quickly. They adapt quickly not only with regular army routines and training, but probably they'll also adapt quicker with the immense psychological stress that the modern combat field puts on an individual soldier. And we use our reservists not only to fill up the rank and file positions, they are also the ones who will lead all the squads and platoons in our wartime army. We can use their civilian expertise. They operate our UAVs or serve as cyber specialists. Many of our best newspaper reporters and PR specialists man the strategic communication units of our reserve army. During the corona crisis, conscript paramedics manned the infection control of the army's field hospital that was sent to the island of Saaremaa, which in the spring was the hotspot of the pandemic in Estonia. Their discipline and training was so good that none of them got infected, which unfortunately is something we couldn't say for civilian hospitals. Yes, one might ask that will reservists in real combat still be as good as fully professional servicemen? I hope really that we'll never need to find out, but in the training, we have thrown our reserve units against the professional and armed to the teeth EFP units during our exercise. And you know, our British and French allies thought that they were against professionals. This gives confidence to us and to the reservists themselves. A little story which I really liked from one of our exercises was that a guy from Narva who had participated in such an international exercise, and their task of the day was to find the tanks in the wood and get saved by these tanks out from the situation. And he said, when I now go home and tell my grandfather that the highlight of my military service was finding a friendly German tank in the woods, he wouldn't believe me. This is about positive societal impact of conscription and reserve service. It really does form a firm bond between the army and the society. It makes national defense an issue for everybody. And I think that there's a good reason why we in Estonia have a relatively stable political and societal consensus on spending at least 2% of GDP on defense. Because most people understand that this money goes to equip and train their own sons, their own daughters, not for a narrow and detached circle of militants. It's all of our business. Our conscription and reserve service is also an excellent way of feedback to the society on how the army is doing, how the taxpayers' money is really spent, and how we shall defend ourselves. You know, you can attack a nation which is afraid, attacking a nation which is not afraid because they know how things will start to go when there is a military situation. That such a nation is far better prepared. And we are far better prepared because we know ourselves. For example, I have a possibility of getting real grassroots feedback from my oldest son. I have two others, but they are too young yet. But this one was very satisfied with his mandatory conscription duty some 5 years ago. And he was really worried that his reserve period was coming to an end and there hadn't been a snap exercise yet. But then it came. He was very happy, very proud. In 2 hours' time, he was already starting to go where he needed to go. And then I started to get really good grassroots feedback from how it is going. As a mother, as a taxpayer, and as a supreme commander of national defense, this was a good learning exercise because finally everything came good. But of course, initially in these first hours, because also the commanders, for them it was snap as well. They were not informed neither. And some of the soldiers actually managed to be so quick that the commanders had not yet realized what is going on. So they had a lot of things which next time they will do better. They had a real discovery that not all vehicles of the logistics units didn't start. These are things that the army actually, because of the snap exercises, cannot also hide anymore, even if it wished. So we have full confidence that all the problems come out. And we know now that at least we have the most honest and selfless logisticians in the world who don't grab the best and newest equipment for themselves, and we can remedy what came out, what was worrisome. This is so important. This model grows societal confidence. And the army also knows that these things have to roughly work. Otherwise, we will not gain this confidence. It's good to know that we have amongst ourselves some 70,000 men and women who have gone through conscription during the last 30 years, and 20,000 Defense League volunteers, and thousands of reserve officers, with a population of 1.3 million. These are people who know how to defend themselves and Estonia, and who know that Estonia can be defended against overwhelming odds. This makes us confident, strong, and that is a deterrent by itself. It's very difficult to attack and defeat a nation who is knowingly confident. Ladies and gentlemen, having said all that, I certainly do not imply that all allies should start copying our system, although there are countries who have re-established conscription over the past years, such as Lithuania and Sweden. No, I believe, as always in all matters, each country should choose their own system that best suits their needs, their geopolitical location and societal trends. Even more, in the case when there is a need to quickly reinforce the Baltic region, we would probably have more use of a French, Danish, or UK professional battalion than of a reservist brigade or division from the same countries who wouldn't have the same knowledge of the terrain, who have not exercised with us. Such a professional brigade or division would certainly be bigger and more powerful. But we do understand that the deployment and use of reservists outside your own country is for everybody a much higher societal threshold than it would be with professionals. This also fits in with our model. Defend yourself with your volunteers, with your reservists, and help the others with your professionals. This is what we do as well. But what could and should be studied is the way we have managed to make our readiness and mobilization system quick and well-functioning. That's vital. That's vital that our allies also understand. And readiness is especially important when it comes to NATO having to reinforce and protect the Baltic Sea region. It's a really good thing that we now have the NATO Readiness Initiative to improve readiness and reaction times in the alliance. But in an ideal world, of course, there shouldn't be a need for that kind of readiness initiatives. Readiness is a core function and a way of life for all our militaries. I wish you all good thinking on these issues and would like to really once more assure you that the Estonian army, may be built differently than many others, is there to defend NATO's eastern flank. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will start with the two ministers in a second. Let us get seated. I have to say it's really good to be on a stage for one reason. You can breathe. It's wonderful. It's an underrated pleasure of our times. What I will do now is that I will ask both ministers to speak for about 10 minutes. I guess you want to do it from the lectern, and then we'll have a discussion, also hopefully involving our audience throughout the world through Zoom, and then we'll have a, as a proper discussion period would do. So may I ask first Mr. Cravinho to take the floor, give an opening introductory remarks, and then we'll go further. Mr.
Thank you very much, Sven. My dear colleague and friend, Jüri, Luik, ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are here with us and those of you who are listening in from around the world. Tere hommikust, first and foremost, to all. And let me start by thanking you for the very kind invitation to be here. It's really a great pleasure to be in Tallinn, even though many who are participating in this conference don't have that pleasure. Let me say how much I'm enjoying the pleasure of being here in Tallinn. So, in the spirit of this very practical meeting, I would like to go straight to a few main points. Perhaps they'll be expanded upon later in the Q&A. And in particular, I would like to specifically share a few reflections on the way that the virus that we've all been living with has impacted upon our thinking in Portugal on matters of national defense. Early on in the pandemic, in March and April, there was quite a lot of international discussion about the relative merits of democracies and autocracies in combating the pandemic. I mean, quite a lot of discussion, of course, in the democracies, because where there's freedom of expression in non-democratic countries, such a discussion would imply the possibility of criticizing the regimes, which would not be acceptable. So there was quite a lot of discussion in our countries. We had this debate in our societies. One of the arguments was that autocratic regimes were better at combating the pandemic because they could enforce draconian repressive measures. And if you don't care about democratic values, of course, it is indeed possible to have a policy which is not just the famous test and trace, but actually test, trace, and detain. And this happened in a number of countries, which were rapidly able to reduce infection rates in this manner. But for democracies, this kind of authoritarian measures was not an option, even though in many countries, including in my own, the governments were given emergency powers for dealing with the pandemic. So in Portugal, this happened. We had emergency powers over a period of 6 weeks. But it was extremely important for us during that period that Parliament continued to meet, journalists continued to do their work, and newspapers and televisions continued to inform the public and to allow for sustained discussion and debate. And this was front and center of our concerns, and as a member of government participating in cabinet meetings, in discussions, I can tell you how central this was for the way that we were looking at the virus during those early days. The armed forces were deployed for many purposes, to help sanitize old age homes and schools, to help the planning capabilities of other sectors. But civilian command was always absolutely paramount. And so the effort was placed in the context of civil protection, not in the context of a war effort. And possibly this meant that the virus took a little bit longer to come under control. But what is vital is that it meant that we did not sacrifice our core values in the process of combating the pandemic. Transparency was helpful in working out what were the best responses. And over time, we were able to adjust and to improve our strategies because there was appropriate critical scrutiny. So the combat against the virus, which is most likely going to be with us for probably another year or maybe even more, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so this makes it all the more fundamental for us to develop our strategies without ever losing care of the fundamental values that make our societies free and democratic. And ultimately, I have no doubts in saying that this has made our response better and it has made our societies stronger. Now, I wanted to mention this because I believe that this has been a bit underestimated when we talk about societal resilience. We must throw in, when we discuss societal resilience, we must throw in not only protecting national power grids, protecting our financial system, protecting our transport networks, protecting our supply chains. These are all, of course, vital, but we have to focus as well on understanding that the resilience of our democratic values and institutions is fundamental to our response. And I make this point because I believe that one of the great threats that we currently face, threats that we have gathered together, we have grouped together under the title hybrid attacks, are attacks that consciously seek to undermine the cohesion and the values of our democratic societies. The pandemic, of course, was not produced intentionally. There are some conspiracy theories that we've all heard about that, but there's no evidence of anything purposeful in the pandemic. However, if a state actor or terrorist group wished to wage hybrid warfare on our countries, it has clearly been demonstrated that a biological or a chemical attack could cause tremendous damage, as indeed COVID-19 has done. So from a defense perspective, I believe that we have to use this unexpected global tornado as a useful learning experience. One aspect that we have all been aware of as we shifted to our home offices is that digitalization of our societies and our economies means increased cyber vulnerabilities and therefore increased responsibilities for our cyber defense and our cyber security. Digitalization, obviously, is much more than the Zoom meetings that we've all been doing. It is, to summarize or to simplify, it's a process that has penetrated deeply into our economies. It is at the heart of our Industry 4.0 transformations. So the consequences of denial of service could be dramatic. Fortunately, we have Estonia. Firstly, we have Estonia's very early understanding of the importance of cyber as a domain of warfare, dating right back to 2004, the year that Estonia joined Nato and European Union as well. Then, secondly, we have Estonia's experience, terrible experience of suffering an attack which was very seriously coordinated and very seriously financed in 2007, and this was a lesson for everybody. Thirdly, we have here in Estonia the establishment of the Center for the Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence that I visited yesterday, which provides extremely useful training and support for 28 NATO allies. And fourthly, we have a very rich ecosystem of Estonian companies and experts that constitutes a major asset for all of us as allies. So thank you, Estonia. Of course, Estonia will not solve all of our problems, though, but it has helped to show us the way. And the Estonian availability to work with allies such as Portugal is a very important contribution to our collective defense. Another aspect that has been rendered very prominent by our COVID experience is that military capabilities are a fundamental part of our response to civil emergencies. All over Europe, this has been the case. And in Portugal, we offered an early template for tracking what each of us were doing in the employment of our military assets to combat the pandemic. But going forward, the point is that we have good reasons to expect that civil emergencies are going to be an increasing arena of activity for our armed forces. Conventional threats on our borders have not disappeared, and here in Estonia, you are extremely well qualified to understand this. NATO, as a collective defense alliance, can never omit or forget this dimension. But at the same time, and despite the enormous contributions that our armed forces have made in combating the pandemic, we clearly have a lot to do in making our military more fit for purpose in responding to civil emergencies. The dynamics of climate change, together with the ever-increasing possibilities of hybrid warfare, suggest to me that more and more we are going to be calling upon our militaries for support in dealing with emergencies that strike all of our society. And we need, therefore, to make our societies more resilient to the challenges that come either from nature, as COVID did, or from our enemies, or from some combination of the two of them. This means really thinking as we move forward, transforming our armed forces about the manner in which we employ them in our civil emergencies. So we have, of course, now to focus as governments on helping our economies to recover from the virus, but I would suggest that military spending must continue to be a part of the answer in order to help make our societies more resilient. And in fact, military spending can be and should be a very useful contribution to economic recovery in itself. But that's another story. What I would like to underline is my view that in terms of using our armed forces for responding to civil emergencies, which is, I believe, as I said, I believe will become more and more frequent in the future. We have an excellent ground for EU-NATO collaboration, which is something that both Portugal and Estonia care deeply about. Because on the one hand, we have the most successful military alliance in history, and on the other hand, we have a profoundly wide-ranging union of countries that have come together in organizing collectively so many different aspects of their economies and their societies. So making our societies more resilient, for example, to cyber and hybrid challenges is something for which we need both of these institutions and for which we should be encouraging these institutions to work together, particularly as the European Union develops now its defense identity. As next semester's presidency of the European Union, we're of course very much aware and alert to this, and we'll be focusing a good deal of our energies in promoting this kind of collaboration between EU and NATO. So I would like to finish here, knowing that there are very many aspects that I hope will come out in the Q&A session, leaving you with the suggestion that this is the kind of terrain on which we should be working in order to make our societies more resilient, more capable of dealing with, to be honest, the very worrying prospects that we have ahead of us. Thank you.
Mr. Luik.
Thank you very much, dear friend, dear Minister Cravinho, dear João, and of course, dear Sven. Always happy to speak here at the ABCD. As a former director of ABCD myself, I can only marvel how quickly and in a very distinguished way the Institute has developed. And let me use this opportunity to say thanks to Sven for his enormous work and obviously wish you good luck in your diplomatic career in our brotherly Finland. And of course, there is an open competition going on for the next director of the Institute. So hopefully people who are interested will run, and I'm sure an excellent woman or man will be selected by the board. Let me start by saying that resilience, which is the central topic of the conference, along with military defense, these are not new and fancy or mysterious buzzwords in the vocabulary of security policy matters. Resilience is basically, as a term, well understood as the capability to withstand or recover successfully from various types of pressure, calamities, or attacks. And of course, it needs a whole of the society approach, encompassing both political, military, economic, cyber, information security, what have you. I will focus on our favorite topic, which is, of course, Russia, and our resilience in response to Russia's policy and actions. Considering the title of the conference. And I would not like you to get a false impression that resilience popped up suddenly in connection with the so-called Gerasimov doctrine of hybrid warfare and Russian aggression against Ukraine. Estonia, for example, is under Russia's political, economic, military, societal, and disinformation pressure with its ups and downs from early 90s. We resisted nevertheless and achieved our main goals, including membership in NATO and the European Union. The cyber dimension of resilience became prominent, as my friend said, already in 2007 with a massive cyber attack by Russia. There is a huge baggage of historic wisdom that we must employ for reinforcing our safety and security. I particularly like the quote from Sir Winston Churchill, who pronounced, "If you are going through hell, just keep going." Dear colleagues, of course, the world suffers from COVID-19, and unfortunately, there is no end to the pandemic in sight. But in addition, we have to conclude what we see is Russia's assertive and aggressive policy and behavior, which has not really changed. We have to stand together to face these major challenges, as well as other challenges and issues, just as rise of China or climate change. The very basis of our resilience is what I would call political resilience, the capability of NATO and EU member states to react individually and above all collectively in a timely, firm and proportionate manner to challenges, threats and gross misconduct of other actors. The spirit of democracy, the spirit of free society is really the basis of the resilience, and it's very important that we would not allow the populists to have oversized influence on our societies. That is extremely important. Russia's open and direct support for crushing brutally the Belarusian people, as well as Navalny's poisoning, are relevant examples. Are we now going to respond adequately by imposing really painful sanctions on perpetrators, or just limit ourselves to the statements of condemnation? Political resilience also means opposing and demonstrating that Kremlin meddling in Western democratic elections and support to far-right parties ultimately does not succeed, as Russia has then much more to lose than to win. What are the main lessons, for instance, for me, in this context? First, NATO's deterrence and defense from Arctic to the Black and Mediterranean Sea must be continuously upheld and strengthened. The EFP, the American EDI, and other forms of Allied presence in the Eastern flank must be maintained robust and in combat readiness. It's very important to signal to Russia that all the military options, all the military adventures are off the table. We are ready to play if you want to play, but in the military sphere, don't think of anything stupid. But of course, it's very important to keep in mind also that NATO is a whole. It's a political body from north to south. And for us, for Estonia, it is extremely important that we can participate in the NATO or EU or allied operations in the south. You know that our biggest commitment today in military terms is in Africa, in Mali. We are also in the EU naval force in the Mediterranean, Operation Irini. I'm very happy that my Portuguese colleague is here, not only because I can learn a lot about the issues which Portugal deems important, and Portugal, as a founding member of NATO, as an Atlantic country, a country whose only sort of the only shoreline is with the Atlantic Ocean, brings a strong Atlantic approach to the table. So although our countries are geographically quite far from each other, we are the furthest countries apart geographically in terms of allies. But our commitment to facing threats both from the east and from the south, and our commitment to allied and transatlantic unity, I think is very similar, very, very common. Let me also bring to you some points regarding our national perspective when it comes to resilience in our own countries, in our own country. And of course, COVID was and still is a great test case for that. President Kaljulaid gave an excellent introduction to the issues pertaining our reserve army, defense league, and the various opportunities, especially in military sphere, which these capabilities bring to us. But of course, these bodies have been extremely important also in facing civilian threats, like COVID-19. Now, when the epidemic started, first we were quite worried that how shall we continue with a program of exercises? How will we organize the armed forces in a way that there wouldn't be large COVID outbursts at the military bases? I think we did very well here. I'd like to thank Commander of our armed forces, Major General Herem, who I think devised an excellent strategy in avoiding that kind of a health crisis, and we have so far been very, very successful here. We have also managed to conduct exercises, regardless of COVID, and not only our own exercises, but joint exercises with the British, the Danish, and other allied forces. I'm also very happy that these governments trusted our regime and regimen for the COVID epidemic and allowed their own troops to participate. One British officer told me during the spring storm exercise that they have orders from London to participate only in the most essential exercises. And I asked whether the exercise in Estonia is considered most essential. He said, "Why do you ask? Obviously." So I was extremely happy to hear that. But of course, we also participated in supporting the civilian society. You know, people instinctively know that there are armed forces with their own capabilities, which could be used for civilian purposes. But we had the opportunity this time to actually show what we have, so that also in the next crisis, people know that army is not something which is behind a high wall, behind a high fence, but it is something which can participate. And the resources which have been bought with the taxpayers' money are there also available for civilian emergencies, if we want to face or if we need to face civilian emergencies, especially various logistical capabilities. We deployed, as the President already mentioned, a military hospital to our island of Saaremaa, which was most hardly hit by COVID. And as people from Saaremaa told me, this wasn't only a practical capability, it was also a symbol that the Estonian people on the mainland haven't forgotten about them. And even the army has come to support them. So it had both practical meaning, but also, I think, a deep symbolic meaning. I mean, there is a whole list of ways how the armed forces, the Defense League participated. We augmented border control, border guarding, assisted medical personnel, worked in hospital receptions, counseled population via crisis telephones. So I would say we did a lot. And we also actively participated in the international response to COVID virus. Estonia, for instance, sent masks and financial support via International Red Cross to countries like Italy and Spain. And thirdly, societal resilience in present conditions is highly dependent on the governments of allies and European Union to mitigate the consequences of a pandemic. First of all, in the economic sector. As my Portuguese colleague already mentioned, defense spending is actually a win-win situation. We can both increase our defense capabilities, but we can also support local economies and advance local labor market by providing jobs to those who need them most. Well, for instance, Estonian Armed Forces, Estonian Defense Ministry still builds a lot of various military in various military bases, and really we spend all this money in Estonia. So it is really something which helps our economy. But this also means that we have to keep up the defense spending, and I'm very happy that the government yesterday made a decision to support, regardless of the falling GDP, strong, good defense spending, which I think, again, is of immense practical use, but also important, serves as an important political signal to our allies and enemies alike. So, the better NATO allies cope individually and collectively with COVID-19, the more strongly we signal resolve, solidarity, and capability to a potential aggressor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister Luik. Thank you both ministers for excellent segues into the topic of societal resilience and also NATO and reserves. And I think we have heard a lot of very interesting stories from Madam President, her personal family-related issues and how the reserve system is working. And really I can say that in months of March, April, when you were watching Estonian late evening TV news, which was of course mostly about the pandemic, you saw pretty much on every stage where something was done positive, someone in a uniform, whether it's a Defense League member, whether it's in a crisis staff headquarter, military professionals doing the planning job, whether you saw augmentation to the border guard, for example, when the border controls were restarted from the Defense League. And I think that really showed that if you have planned for the worst, you can deal with different range of issues, what you cannot predict. Like, of course, we were not able to predict this pandemic. But I will like to start the discussion now with the ministers and maybe start with one thing what Minister Luik said, that both Estonia and Portugal are very, very transatlantic countries in their outlook and security. And that basically means, of course, also that both countries value US continued military and political presence in Europe immensely. But that brings me to a quite a tricky question connected to that. And this is, of course, the news that we had a couple of months ago, the US troop relocation and withdrawal. Some relocated from Germany to other countries in Europe, and some to be taken back to the United States. So basically, how do you assess the health of NATO as a military and political alliance nowadays? And what do you see the future perspectives for that? Maybe I'll start, Mr. Cravinho, with you.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that question, and I look forward to speaking for the next 3 hours on the topic. Let me start with the specific issue that you mentioned before widening to the broader dimension of the future of NATO. The specific issue on the relocation of American troops, I think on this matter we understand that there is a certain amount of volatility associated to pre-electoral circumstances. All of our countries in pre-electoral circumstances, to one degree or another, have a certain amount of volatility. And I think that the deeper aspect of the way in which American troops are deployed in support of NATO is something that we need to look at over a longer time frame. And going into the first half of 2021, I think we will be better positioned. What's fundamental for us is that NATO retains absolutely all of its capacity to act as a deterrent, and also that it retains all of its capacity to act a little bit further afield, such as in Africa, where NATO assets have been extremely important, even if NATO itself has not been directly involved. So AFRICOM is, for us, an aspect of NATO, of the US presence in Europe that we value highly, and that we hope that a good solution can be found. But I believe that as soon as we get over the electoral, independently of the electoral election results in the US, it'll be a better moment for us to be looking at the way that the US and dialoguing with the US and looking at the way that the American troops are deployed with a view to our common purpose. The future of NATO is one that, I think all of us in this alliance, which I classify it as the most successful military alliance in history, place a lot of faith in its future and see very good raison d'etre for its continued existence, including some of the original raisons d'etre that remain present. However, the world is changing very, very fast. We have to acknowledge this. All of us have to acknowledge this in Europe as well. We have to look at the way that NATO in the next few years can not only remain relevant, which with its original purposes, but actually become also significant for changes that are happening in the world. Nobody imagines, of course, and I don't believe that one should, think that China should be identified as the new Soviet Union. And this makes no sense at all because of the entirely different nature of the challenges that are posed. This is not to say that NATO doesn't have a role with respect to the rise of China. Exactly what kind of role? Certainly not the same kind of role that it had with respect to the Soviet Union. So come 2021, I think, independently of who is in the White House, but perhaps differently, depending on who is in the White House, we need to be going into depth on issues of the future of a NATO that we all hold very dearly and which perhaps of us see in different manners in the future. But I'm confident that the next early next year we'll have conditions, new conditions for that kind of conversation.
All right, thank you very much. Jüri.
Quite honestly, we have expressed concern with the possible withdrawal of US troops from Europe because we believe that their presence in Europe serves as an important deterrent against possible Russian adventures. And of course, we have pointed out that we are glad that some of these troops have been moved, or there is a decision to move them to various Eastern European countries, but we wouldn't want it to be in the expense of Germany. We don't see this as as some type of a positive correlation. We are also happy that that many of those troops remain, and not a big amount will actually be withdrawn. I think the presence is very important. The likelihood that you can fly in from various directions when the crisis starts, there will be a lot of difficulties in getting in here when the crisis is already brewing. I mean, half of the hall consists of military men, and I think you can all well imagine, especially looking at the very complicated geographical position of the Baltic states. So I think the physical presence of Allied troops, US and other allies, is of absolutely crucial importance. We understand that the plan for the withdrawal is long and multifaceted, so how it will exactly play out is probably difficult to say. And I'm saying it only because of our deep love and respect towards the role the United States is playing in Europe and the immense importance of the transatlantic relationship, both in political and in economic terms. Of course, there is, as my Portuguese colleague mentioned, political battle brewing in Washington, and those who like raw politics, I would advise you to look at the yesterday evening's debate of the two presidential candidates. So I would advise you to see it. This is really, really impressive. Yeah, let's see how it develops, but we deeply appreciate the fairly persistent presence of US troops in the Baltic states for various exercises. I think the model which has been chosen by bringing in units to the Baltic states, perhaps not sort of continuously being present regarding one or the other unit, but really rotating them through the Baltic states, is also very important and beneficial to Estonia, and hopefully also provides new training opportunities to the US forces. I think this is very important dynamic in our relationship.
Thank you very much. I will ask last question from my side, and then I will open the questions to the floor, and also picking up from the audience all around the globe. Ministers, defense spending, both of you, of course, mentioned that. And Minister Luik, may I congratulate you on coming out from quite a heated political debate this time in Estonia concerning the defense spending, with both nominal and GDP-wise growth of defense spending. But at the same time, our economies are contracting, and the debt level is mounting. Estonia started from practically level 0, but we're climbing up very quickly on a debt level. So basically, what are your predictions on, not just in Estonia and Portugal, but wider in transatlantic alliance on the future of defense spending? Are you fearing, let's say, the overreaction to the last crisis, in a way that basically societies have a tendency to look at the last calamity and then think that the next one is going to be the same, in a way like it was after 9/11, everything was asymmetric, and after 2014, everything became hybrid, whether now everything becomes, pandemic. Jüri, start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you for your congratulations. And as I said, extremely happy that we managed to maintain our good defense spending. I think it's very important for politicians to go out to their own publics and make their case about military spending, the importance of military spending. And I really believe that COVID, in a way, had a silver lining for the military, because we didn't retreat behind the high walls. We really participated, and this was recognized by the society. And the Estonian military actually has a lot of logistical resources which can be deployed also in the next crisis, or during this crisis, if it worsens. So I think that kind of feeling that we have a common cause, regardless of the crisis, greatly helped in this debate. But I mean, we all have to be responsible, including the military establishment, including the defense ministry. We have to understand the general concerns of the society. We cannot play outside the general difficulties. We have to make our case, but we also have to understand that kind of overblown wishes might actually have negative consequences when it comes to communicating with the rest of the society. And obviously, it's extremely important that we can maintain defense spending all over the alliance, especially in Europe. We sort of felt that now it gets going. Now everybody can chip in. But of course, COVID makes it more difficult, but I hope we haven't lost the momentum.
Mr. Cravinho.
Yes, thank you, Sven. I think that we have to divide between two aspects. What we in defense ministries or in armed forces understand as being necessary in terms of our military capabilities, and how we communicate with the public. And they're slightly different. They shouldn't be contradictory or not, but they are slightly different issues. With respect to the first, I would say that we do still need, I mentioned this point, we do still need our traditional military tools to be able to deter potential incursions by enemies. And there's no doubt about that. We need purely military assets for military purposes. At the same time, we do also need increasingly, and I sought to explain why I believe that's the case, the capacity for dual use, the possibility of using military assets for non-military or not entirely military emergencies. Like in Estonia, the Portuguese public has been extremely pleased, welcoming of the way that the military have been involved in responding to the pandemic. So here now we're shifting to how we communicate with our public. And I think that the Portuguese public would certainly at this point be very much available to the statement, we need to support the military more so that the military can support the Portuguese people more in case of an emergency. That is something that it's an argument that I believe it's fairly straightforward to make. And at the same time, it's also the case that there's an argument to be made, and I think the Portuguese public will be sensitive to the notion that military spending can be good for our economy and economic recovery is a priority. So those are the aspects that I would emphasize in discussing with the public in work with our preparation for the future of Portuguese defense. I think that the issue is slightly different and they're not incompatible. We should be working on the two levels, and I think it is perfectly possible to have coherence internally as we move forward. So I'm fairly optimistic. We're going to have a strange situation now, which is that probably 2020 statistics will show a percentage increase in military spending, because military spending in most countries has not declined immediately, but our GDP will decline. So we're going to have a blip. 2021, 22 are going to be challenges, as there will be pressures to rein in defense spending in order to spend on other parts of the economy. So I hope to be as successful next week as Jüri has been this week in defending the military budget, and I believe that it won't suffer 2021, but it will come under pressure. And I think those arguments about the importance of military spending for our economy, the importance of military spending for preparing our societies for something like, yes, we always do prepare for the last war that we fought, but that's I think, politically relevant, and it gives us some leverage.
Thank you, Minister. Questions from the audience? So I have one from the audience across the globe, and this actually ties very well to what you ended up with, Minister. And this comes from Christoph Bilben. And the question is, given their unpredictability, how can European and NATO foresight of military and non-military threats be improved? I mean, we have had, this exercises like strategic foresight, looking 30 years ahead. And I have no idea how many of those emphasized a pandemic, for example, as a big disruptor of our societies. So what could be done in order to improve our ability to look into the future? Bearing in mind, as the famous US baseball coach Yogi Berra said, that it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. Mr. Cravinho.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not aware of any scenario. We are aware, of course, of some scenarios that said, okay, a pandemic, but nothing on this scale. Nothing that, posited the kind of impact that COVID-19 has had on our societies. So, in one sense, you're tempted to say, well, imagination needs to be better. But the real value of developing scenarios is not just the exercise of the imagination, because if you use your imagination to develop 1,000 scenarios, maybe one of them will be right. The real value is to say, what kind of challenges are likely, are possible, and where are our vulnerabilities? I think this experience has made us all much more aware of the need to focus on the vulnerabilities of our societies, rather than on the specific nature of the way those vulnerabilities might be exploited. And that's why I think that Estonia's early cyber foresight, cyber experience is, in retrospect, even more valuable now. We need to, as our societies become more complex, more interlinked, and more dependent on technologies, we really need to take a much harder look at the vulnerabilities that we are creating on a daily basis.
Thank you. Jüri.
Well, since we are here in the ICDS conference, I would at first say that the think tanks like ICDS provide valuable insights to the challenges of the future. Quite honestly, being in office every day and dealing with a lot of stuff, it really leaves very little time for discussions, deliberations. So ICDS plays very, very important role. In general, when looking at future risks, I think we have to, let's say, from the Estonian point of view, we have to distinguish between different risks. There are some risks which we can face with minimum international support. But there are some risks which Estonia could never, ever face alone. And of course, the biggest risk is what is now called the near-peer conflict between major powers. Here, Estonia is wholly dependent on its allies. And I very much echo what was said. We shouldn't forget these quote-unquote heavy military scenarios. And when people write their own national security concepts and national military strategies, I think they should keep it in mind, because it's very easy when looking at the future, become very euphemic and talk about the new threats like climate change and what have you. And these are important threats. But we also have to see that our military is prepared for the absolutely worst option and has tools and knowledge and resources to face that. So I very much welcome the US strategies focus, the defense strategies focus on the conflict with near-peer enemy. This is important, important stuff.
Thank you, Jüri. Actually, that reminded me of 20 years ago when Mr. Luik was my ambassador at the Estonian mission to NATO. There was another effort of reforming of a NATO committee system ongoing. As I think it's in every 5 years there is another big reform effort. And one of the committees which was most ridiculed by ambassadors, of course not by you, was the Committee on the Challenges of Modern Society. And now this is something what we would have needed in 2007, by which time it was already disbanded, when we had our challenge to our modern society here in the form of a cyber attack. And in 2020, when we have another type of challenge to our modern society. We have time for one last question from the audience. Speak up now or be ever silent. I think the clock hit exactly 00, so I think we can wrap up with ministers. I want you to have a chance to say something what you think was left unsaid, what was because a question you were expecting did not come. So basically, last words, concluding words. Mr. Cravinho.
I understand that's given me another 3 hours. No, I just wanted to say how much I've appreciated listening to President Kaljulaid and learning a little bit about the reserve system. This is something, usually you don't go abroad to point out the failings of your own country, but it's not a state secret. We disbanded our military service in 2004, our conscription, and since then we have on paper a reserve system, which we are now finally getting down to actually putting into practice. So listening to the way that in Estonia you look at and work the reserve system has been a great learning experience, which I'm going to be taking back. Not that the situation is similar, not that we can do the same thing, but we learn a lot from this opportunity. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Minister.
I couldn't say that everything was said here in this panel, but I think we covered a lot of ground, so it only leaves me the pleasure of thanking ICDS, thanking you, João, for coming and joining us for the conference, and thanking you, Sven, for your work and for setting up this conference.
Thank you, ministers, and please, ladies and gentlemen, also at your homes and at offices, please join me in applause. Thank you.